Healthy shame is the psychological foundation of all humility. It is the source of spirituality.
So what I hear, the operative word, shall we say, is healthy.
Yeah. You mightn't often put healthy and shame in the same sentence. Yeah. I think most of us would run the other way, wouldn't it? Shame. There's something healthy about that. Yeah. You hear that also, Jake?
Yeah, I think the healthy for me is like, so shame is uncomfortable. And I'm wondering, how can it become a healthy shame? So there's two things. When I'm humbled when I'm forced towards some humility, and I may feel a little bit embarrassed or uncomfortable about that. But humility in itself is a very useful, if the ego can absorb it, it's a useful thing. If we talk about a darker shame, that is an unjustified shame, for which we should not, that doesn't humble us or is not helpful for us, so basically a destructive shame, to heal that probably does mean to stay with that. So it's like taking the shame by the horns and accept that you have this experience of shame and lean into it to work through it and get out the other side. Because it may be an intrinsic part of how we feel as human beings, that some people are more naturally leaning towards feeling shame. So we can't get rid of it sometimes, but we can overcome it or live with it. But the shame is living with us rather than us living with the shame. So who's walking whom? Who's taking whom by the hand? Am I walking in following the shame, or is it saying, shame, you're part of what makes me, but I decide the direction and you're part of my journey?
Yeah. I like the distinction, that you've made, because I feel like, so that those words were from Bradshaw, who did a lot of work, John Bradshaw, who did a lot of work on recovery, and he was a recovering addict himself, American man. It's from a book, Healing the Shame That Binds Us. And I think what he would talk about is toxic shame. And I think other, maybe more spiritually oriented, well, actually, John was very spiritually orientated as well. Actually, the back of that book is about healing that shame. And but whereas other people would talk about a shame-based identity, like where I confuse, I am the thing that I've done. So I'm saturated in shame. Whereas I think what David White would say, reflect, the poet, that shame is actually our friend. And we're always going to have shame. And like even psychologically, shame begins to develop very early in our lives, I think, even before, in the first year of life, I think. And so like, either does it become us, is it so saturated in me that I believe that's who I am? And my experience of sitting with people, my experience of my own working through shame, is that where it seeps really into someone, it really lays them very low to the ground, and it causes them to hide. Because we would all hate anybody to know what any of us have done. And yet we've all walked that road. Like there's not one of us in life that has done things that, I often say to people, well, that wasn't your finest moment. Maybe that wasn't, that wasn't your proudest moment. And also, and it's not an attempt to rescue people. And sometimes what I'll say to them, Jake, is, I wonder, could you take in my gaze? Because what we're wanting to offer in the gaze is the dissipation of the shame that's after taking hold as somebody's core identity. And that's
So what happens then if you engage with the gaze of another? Do you dissipate?
You dissipate the shame, like, because, like, say I'm thinking about men's groups that I've both facilitated and been a participant in, where sometimes somebody shared, like, so maybe when I was younger, for example, that I grew up in a household where, it was shameful to be vulnerable. I was made to feel ashamed, so I was humiliated around my vulnerability. This happens, many people. It also doesn't happen for other people, which is great. And so when I share, say in a group, and I drop into my vulnerability, and then the shame can, oh my God, what? Oh, that phrase, I could die of shame.
Yeah.
And then the facilitator might say, I wonder what might it be like to pick one man in the group and just begin to take in his gaze. And it's beautiful to witness, because say maybe you'll feel closer to some more than others, and it's unconscious. And as the man begins to steady himself in the gaze, it's like something in him is restored. It's like a medicine for the soul. Begins to steady, and then the facilitator might say, "Oh, I wonder now, could you begin to take in another person in the group?" And just witnessing that, being part of that, because both he and the group are being restored. We're in the experience of, redemption. Because again, Bradshaw says, he says, I was reading this lately, and he was saying, it comes closest to the to describing human bondage as anything he's ever encountered in his life. And my experience is sitting with people where they have that level of shame inside them, that more toxic shame, as opposed to the healthy shame that it imprisons them, and it causes them to hide.
So the dissipation also of the phenomenon, and also the shadow that it casts over us. You spoke about the text from the Gospel of Thomas, apocryphal. It's not, but still, we have to also read the things that are apocryphal. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you.
Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting that shame, it can be a salvation only if we bring it out, and that gaze is reminding you of that. And so if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. So it's like an undigested shame that will continue to haunt you and make your life a misery, or ultimately even destroy you. Right. And we see, of course, when people suffer tremendously, they do horrible things to themselves, and addiction is one of those.
I'm so glad you've named that, Jake, because at one point in my life, I worked with people bereaved through suicide, and I've also sat with people who've been in that place. And as I've listened to their families, who were bereft, and sometimes their family sharing things courageously, you certainly were hearing something of shame, felt like shame, and I wondered about it. And I believe also people who have been in that place, of true suicidality, they're often saying, I'm flawed, and I'm so defective. Like, if people really knew me, if people, and people actually say this, like if people got close to me, really, I'd infect you. Where people have been deeply traumatized, there's a sense, actually, some of them feel that if I allow you to get really close, you're going to get, the sickness in me is going to infiltrate you. Now, sometimes, of course, what's happening is that they've internalized the shame of who has ever violated them. So oftentimes the work is giving that back, releasing it. And I think the Gospel of St. Thomas, the genius of that statement, I don't know when that Gospel was written, But I think there's a real genius in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it leads me on to a couple of things, but one of them, that the imprisonment of shame is with the victim and not with the perpetrator, right? So when you rape is I'm not saying forgotten by the by the perpetrator, but there's no shame around it because it was a dominating act. But even by vilifying the perpetrator or holding a grudge or all of that, you are forever imprisoned in this shame and hiding it and not, so it's already, I guess, a great step for somebody who's being abused to be able to put it on the table, right? Because then when we can start to work with it. And forgiveness works also like that in very ordinary things. Like when I don't forgive people very ordinary things, they don't even remember that they did it. And I'm still like, well, I remember that time when you didn't buy me a present on my birthday. It was terrible. Right. And however childish, I'm trying to keep it a little bit light, but by forgiving, not forgetting, right? So it's part of your learning journey, but not part of your living journey, right? Because you're just making life less useful and yourself less effective by staying in the past, right? And there's a comfort with staying in the past, right? Because you know that Johnny is a bad person. You don't have to make any effort, and he doesn't have to develop, right? Because he might actually be a round character like what we all are. But that creates uncertainty, right? That relationship where there may be healing, and like the paralytic man who says to Jesus, "Well, no, I can't really get to the bath to get healed," because this, we talked about it last time, I think, but or in a preparatory conversation, because begging and making money is a stable living. So, and then the proposal that this might be changed is extremely daunting. What would it look like? Yeah. So there's also the alibi, for fear of a justified fear, right? For the person going through the experience.
Yeah. Because I just listening to that, like, so we all develop habits, ways of being in the world, and we kind of, thinking about shame, maybe we've shamed about certain things that we've done, that have been done to us, etc. And so there's this identity, but then who am I beyond that? Who am I beyond what I've done, or what I've done to me? And I think we think about a term like victim consciousness. And of course, people have been brutalized, people have been victimized. That is very true. I would never want to not acknowledge, because I'd be complicit in something, and yet, and beyond, like, my experiences, how my experiences inform me, how I can speak from that place. Sometimes you listen to people, you'll find it in AA rooms, you'll find it with other courageous men and women who'll speak about experiences that they've had, and yet there's no hint, as I listen to them, that they have identified with the experience. But the experience has been worked through in a particular way. And then other times I find myself listening to people on the radio and other things where it feels like something isn't quite sequenced through, and I think shame, can have an enormous hold on us, really, as I said, really lay us low to the ground. I was at of course, I'm in recovery myself, so I have plenty of things that I had to look at. I mean, it's why we do an inventory in the 12 steps. And, and sometimes, maybe we start off, we think about it, oh my God, like, do we really need to do? But don't worry, he knows it all anyway, or he or she knows it all anyway. Wouldn't get too caught up in it. There's this recognition that the shame, that the appropriate guilt, the healthiness, remorse, and then there's an action. What's my action? And one of the things that you would say is, look, you make an amend, unless to do so would be harmful to the person that you're making an amend to. And that requires a real discernment, a real listening. And I think of what it is to be steady enough in ourselves, to have the ego strength, the solidness, in other words, inside ourselves, going to go, yeah, that was me.
Mm. Yeah, and it's a real ask in the recovery process. I'm not in recovery, but I read, not yet, I guess. I've read, of course, the 12 steps, and it's a real ask to say, okay, you make the list, and now you go to these people and you apologize. You say, you're truly sorry. But I imagine that when you do it, with that immediately it evaporates, right? Because you ask for forgiveness. It may be very difficult for this person to give it to you. Maybe they may not give it. We can't control that. But even that might be partly irrelevant, right? Because you've already put it on the table. So it's on the table, so it dissipates part of the shame already, because you just say, yeah, here it is.
Yeah, exactly. You're not defending, you
Yes.
know, and oftentimes, or at least sometimes, people kind of go, oh, it's not, I didn't think about that, boy.
No, and if you look at a more, ordinary shame, we started talking about this a while ago as a theme, and I, in the beginning, found it difficult to connect with shame. So, shame, shame. I'm not really ashamed,
Yeah.
I am. I guess it features less in my life, but it features in everyone's life, because it's a power tool. So if I didn't understand somebody or someone, and you can point that out in front of a group of people, you've lowered me in the pecking order, because you're not so clever, are you?
Yeah.
Right. And so to avoid that in a group, we all find ourselves sometimes not asking a question when we haven't understood something.
That's
now,
right.
If you've never had this experience, great for you.
Yeah.
But I suspect that the majority of our listeners have this experience. And so when I do workshops with people, I say, if you don't understand something and you raise your hand, please know that you will represent the vast majority of the group. And some of us will be extremely grateful that we didn't have to raise our hands and admit such a foolish thing as not understanding something, even though we're all in it. So can you see the dynamic? Please do yourself and the group a favor. If you don't get it, raise your hand.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to create a safe space where that can be done. When you give a workshop and you know that something is not very clear, you start to say, oh, let me re-explain that, because I didn't understand myself even, right? And then you make it a little bit funny and end and say, guys, this cannot be understood in one way, because we're trying to make sense of something. It's not a cognitive, logical process of like, we go from A to B and now we're all on the same page. Your sense making is a process that takes more time. It's complex. But see, so for that shame piece, I start to see that actually it does feature in everyone's life in a very, very disabling way.
Yeah.
Or in a lighter way, but still it's good to be aware of what's happening.
We were, I believe so. And I like that word disabling, and I guess to a greater or lesser degree in all of our lives, because I have a friend of mine who would say that, shame's in every encounter, that like in a therapy room, that it's often there, it's in the room, whether it's named or not. And we were, you and I have been doing a little bit of exploration lately, and full disclaimer here, I am no expert on the Enneagram. I don't want to speak for you, Jake, but I think also you'd say, like, we're interested in it's a tool, it's a narrative tool, hasn't it, that comes from
absolutely
all of the many great traditions brought into America by Oscar Ishezo, I think, who was a psychiatrist, and then validated in Stanford and popularized by people like Helen Palmer. And the interesting thing about the Enneagram is, there are 9 faces. They talk about the soul, and so there are 9 types of personality types, but it talks about your core wound, which is really interesting. And we're kind of doing a little bit of exploration and saying, maybe I'm a 4, so I'm a 4. I read it and I kind of go, it's taken me quite a number of years to kind of maybe get to this. And you're saying you're an 8. We were talking about the differences. And without getting into There'll be people maybe listening that are really well versed in the Enneagram. But the 8 you were sharing with me this morning, Jake, weren't you? There's a certain shamelessness in the 8. And in the 4, shame can rule their life quite a lot and cause them to hide. And it's not that the 8 doesn't feel shame or the 4 always feels shame. As we were talking about it, and so I was reading it last night, I think you were reading it as well, it's like, oh yeah,
and maybe there's a call out here to an expert who can elucidate. I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of, maybe we've got something to teach one another. I need to understand shame better to be a better accompanier of people, and also of myself, to understand the shame that I do have. And I also don't understand if the 8 is shameless because he's naturally comfortable, or it's a resistance piece, right? So I'm just shameless because I don't like other people suffering from shame. So it's like a reactive mechanism, not really a centered activity. So the 8 is a challenger, so it's a little bit wanting to be against, right? So it could be like an immature phenomenon. I can laugh at myself, so it's fine. But if somebody would like to tell us more, then we're very open. And in the meantime, we'll continue to study as 2 hacks on the Enneagram.
Because not only it's not simply a model or a theory. It's something that can begin to be embodied. And I'm thinking back to the Gospel of Thomas. If I begin to embody that in me and I begin to meet it, then my life is transformed. I mean, given, in the Enneagram, they use this word about a redeemed 4, redeemed 9, or redeemed. This is kind of interesting word. People might kind of, I have big problems with that word, redeemed. But redeemed isn't it to make whole, but we're already whole. But the way in which I'm looking at something, is really important. I'm thinking about the gaze, and back to the men in the room and the gaze of people, because sometimes the way we gaze, my gaze towards myself is not generous, is not grace-filled. My gaze towards myself, and I've seen people do this, and I've done it myself, they narrow in on one event in their life, and they use that event as evidence to beat themselves endlessly around the head. And it's painful to witness. It's painful because the maturing or the maturation is the other thing that we might talk about, but other things as well, recovery, whatever words we might use, sobriety, is that we would recognize that in redemption, there is a liberation. So Bradshaw talks about bondage, the biggest, one of the real causes of human bondage, that redemption. I worked with a beautiful woman, Barbara Collins, great therapist that I worked with at one stage. And she was more body orientated. And we were sitting one time and she said, the word redemption keeps coming up. And she gave me this passage. She had this old book. I don't even know what it's from. I have the photocopy of Redemption. And I was reading it, and it made sense to me. I couldn't tell you how it made sense to me, but it made sense to me in my body. And it said that redemption is a liberation from a state of bondage to a state of freedom. And when I sit with people, or in my own life, when you sit with people and you see them open up and let go, because they continue to go over and over old ground, there's no fresh water there.
Yeah.
And I believe it's an avoidance of the grief, which curiously in a 4, that's one of the things they're avoiding. They're avoiding the original hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you enter into a process of transformation with someone, being accompanied, you need to be reminded that you must lean in, right? And so we in the conversation, you typically see that people have all sorts of alibis as to why that is not possible, right? Because somebody got to the water before me to be healed, so I couldn't do it. But and then the great variety of things that the ego can come up with, why things are not possible. But of course, the end phase, where Richard Rohr writes in the weekly newsletter that you sent to me, that as a transformed believer, we know that the stable core dignity is something that God gratuitously gives from the moment of conception. Each of us is inherently, objectively, totally, and forever a child of God. And we cannot gain or lose that by any achievement or failure whatsoever. And so he doesn't participate in the honor and shame system.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're trying to stay away from that, you're not leaning in. Right? So you cannot be shamed. You cannot be shamed, but you feel shame. And so how do you move into that, right? And the longer we push back, the longer the road becomes, because we're pretending we're walking, but we're staying at the same point, right? So it becomes more and more daunting as the road seems to never get shorter, but we're spending more time. It's almost a going backwards, a regressive feeling. So when we commit to wanting to be transformed, is basically saying, I'm going into that difficult conversation. And so when I'm given feedback, from my personal experience, given feedback, I very often start to justify why the feedback wasn't justified. Right? I was basically saying I'm not willing to take the shame of it and start the learning journey. Whereas as soon as you say, I can't quite understand it, but I hear some of it resonates, it's already dissipating. So because you're trying to integrate, say, oh yeah, maybe this could be useful. I could be doing more with that of me and less of that with me. Oh. And you say to the other person, just by saying thank you, I'm trying to process it, and you engage with it, it already becomes less difficult. But there is often a natural resistance, isn't there? I still find myself occasionally, when somebody gives me feedback, I will say, oh, that's probably criticism. I don't, there's a trick to not want to enter into the difficulty of the reality of me, which is also a shame. Basically, you're ashamed that, if you're saying that something that I could do something better, which is an invitation, to take it as I'm not good or not good enough, which might render me not worthy and not be part of the system and out of a relationship. But the God experience is inherently relational, right?
And I think what you're saying, I find myself just really with the word relationship, because in relationship, when somebody gives us feedback, when somebody gives you feedback, me feedback, Jake, in relationship, and it's in relationship, so there won't be any ostracizing, and I can trust the validity of that relationship, then I'm more likely to lean in, to use your expression. And look, whereas I think in that kind of honor and shame system, where people are excluded or scapegoated, of course we wouldn't want to, because it doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel safe to unburden ourselves. It doesn't feel safe to reveal ourselves. And I think we are the revelation. I think within the shame, bringing forth, underneath it all, it's like, well, there I am. There I've been all along. I'm kind of thinking what you're saying about what Rohr says about, I can't recall all of the words, but I found myself in my body responding with, and there's a certain shyness, there's a certain shame. I said, don't say that, Noel, but the word that was coming up inside me was amen.
Amen.
Because in the amen, when you're saying what you're saying, that there's something in us that's invincibly precious. And I believe that many of us struggle to really sit in and drop in and lean into that. But you see, well, there was this thing I did. And if you really knew, we were talking in friendship lately, weren't we, about, as our friendship deepens, it was like, well, if you really knew all of these things about, me and everybody has these things. And it's
to go, and to go. what I was thinking of, how it's a very counterintuitive or paradoxical statement, but there's like invincible, right? There's an indestructible vulnerability. So we think that vulnerability is that spot that where people will stab us, and in fact is where Rudolf Steiner says, in every wound grows a flower, I think, right? So it's an indestructible, it's the source of life, the vulnerability, the hardness, the toughness, the thing that resists change. That's actually the Achilles heel. But the indestructible, invincible vulnerability, and AA is saying, whatever you do, we've all heard it before, and you belong regardless. The only thing that can make you not belong is if you leave. But while you're here, you belong. And maybe even when you're not here, you're still part of this, even if you don't want to be. You belong, you belong, you belong. You cannot not belong.
Yeah.
Right. And to really, that's probably for some people so incomprehensible that might even be true, that there's still, so you're building this safe space, so that people might feel invited more and more to reveal themselves into the true beauty that they are.
Yeah.
Right. And then the complexity of how this works, but Gurdjieff would have his new visitors get them drunk too, so that would be, it's not great for an AA meeting, where you get them drunk to get the brakes off.
Yeah.
And then they would start shaming the person, calling them an idiot and calling them fools, to kind of like, force it upon them. Also, like, if you really want to stay, you can go now if you don't like it, but you're the idiot here, right? So you're the fool. To just shake all of that off, because you're surrounded by idiots.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. There's nothing unusual. Don't think you're special because you have shame. Oh, you're so special. You're nothing special. All the other dumbos, 7 billion dumbos on the planet, right? So
like I was joking with you lately. I don't know. We said, like, I'm an ass. DeMello says, I'm an ass. You're an ass. Don't worry about it. Don't get too caught up on it.
That's right.
And, that part was like James Finley would say about, no matter what we've done, there's something in us all that's beyond the brutalities, of our own will, that's not subject to the brutalities of our own will. Because when we sit with people and when we examine our own lives, think about things, there are many traditions that really do an examine of their lives, and the spiritual autobiography might be a way of examining our lives. Recognize that where those painful things, if they've been born out of some woundedness, this is not a defending of my behavior, anybody's behavior. There's always a context. And curiously, one of the antidotes to shame as well as love is compassion. Because one of the things that happens in shame is that there's a part of our system called the threat system gets activated. And that tends to lead us to make very poor decisions because we've gone into survival. And survival is surface. There's no depth in survival. And survival is not living. And I'm thinking about, as we're deepening in, and how did anybody think that you could be so excited about shame? Like, here we're recording early in the morning.
We're just flipping the system, man. Everybody thought this was going to be awful, and now look how joyous this is. Let's talk about shame. Oh yes, wonderful, great. Let's have a little bit more of that.
Because the relationship between, shame is the source of all spirituality, of humility, the words humility, and, as a friend of mine shared, humiliation. Because sometimes the ego, the unhealthy ego, benefits from a humiliation. And it is painful because the ego hates to be humiliated. Hates it. Because the ego's interest, how am I looking? How am I sounding? Am I being clever here? You know what I mean? How am I dressed? You know what I mean? How many people are listening to this podcast, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I know for me, one of the challenges and one of the gifts in doing it together and being, was also I needed to literally let go of, don't do that, no. Don't put yourself out there. How many of us do that? I've been in certainly teaching over the years where I've been in classrooms where it's very clear that lots of people know an answer to something in a room, and they won't allow their voice to come forward. And then we wonder in the training, I'm just thinking about social workers, we wonder in their training then, how in God's name are they going to help other people liberate their voices? That there's a real relationship between my own liberation, my own finding my own voice, and supporting others to find their voice. And so you're often trying to create, like what you were saying about when you're in a room with people, Jake, you're trying to create this sense of safety, that there's no such thing as a poor question.
That's right.
Somebody asked a question and said, "Oh, thank God they asked that. I had no idea what he was talking about."
That's right. And this inhibition is a kind of a postponement of starting to really come alive, right? Inhibition is kind of putting ourselves on pause and being observers as to of having some fun, of just enjoying simply who we are without any performance or trying to, maybe performing, doing some stuff without caring about what people think of it, but not perform it as a result. It's just simply being and showing up the way that we are in our authenticity and comfortable with ourselves. Yeah. And people want it for us and from us. Yeah. Because we're all inhibited and not giving, because basically we're withholding something from the system. Yeah. And we start to collect it. It becomes very dry. And for teachers and facilitators, it's a nightmare, right? So you got to get them out of something. That's why you do gamification, because people think it's not about them anymore. So suddenly they start showing themselves entirely with a bit of glue and 2 pieces of pasta, making complete fools of themselves happily. And it breaks the ice, right? Because it's nice to say, do you normally work like that? Oh, yeah, I guess I do. But we required a couple of pieces of pasta and some glue to make that an acceptable conversation, because we were all playing with the pasta and we were all showing up as our truth, as who we really are, and it becomes fun, right? And we need to get out of the cognitive and into the heart. And the gut.
And as Moriarty says, the longest journey is from the head to the heart. Journey is from the head to the heart. And we talk about that. I mean, we talk about the contemplative life. That's why people engage for thousands of years in lots of different traditions in the contemplative life, because they're wanting to, it's not just the emotional heart, it's a way of seeing reality, touching it, which is one of the things we were saying early on this week, that we'll, it's one of the pieces we'll certainly move to, sharing about reality, because the reality of who I am is not held in any of us in the things we have done or the things that were done to us. And who we are is more delightful, more generous, more loving than any idea. You see, the thing about an idea is it's too narrow. I believe, like, my idea of anybody is not who they are. But if I can make contact with the reality, that's one of the reasons why I am encouraged when I continue to sit with people in the healing encounter. Because it's an unmistakable feeling when you're in a room with someone and there's a real encounter and they've let go and dropped into who they are and made contact with who they are in their vulnerability, in their nakedness, and settling into that.
Yeah, it's about meeting reality, right? Meeting the reality of you, meeting reality of the other, and getting away from this thinking yourself out of a hole. Because you sit at the bottom of the pit and you do a lot of thinking. There's no hand on the rope, right? Right? So thinking yourself out of a hole, I mean, takes right now on a completely different meaning to me, but and I thought, you can't think yourself out of a hole. It's a bit of an offhand comment, but it is like that. You can feel yourself out of a hole, right? I mean, it's simply by the tactile activity of touch, finding something you can hold on to, right? But the heart and the gut and the intuition and the trusting, all of that need to come into play, and it's a joy, right? So the contemplative life is also not about thinking. It's about experiencing.
Yeah.
And that actually needs to dissipate constructs that you have in your mind about what you are and who others are, and all these constructs that you have that are actually not useful.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, Jake, isn't it? What you're saying about the constructs. And because I think many times we have constructed an idea of who we and others are, and then more than a construct. And I also believe it's why people are never transformed at the level of theories. I can read, for example, all I want about the Enneagram. I can read all about psychological tools, trauma. I can read all I want about meditation, contemplation. Won't transform me one bit. It'll offer some more fuel for the intellect. That's about it. It's not that the theories aren't helpful. I know that when I've met people and they've wanted to interpret me through a theory, I have felt invaded as a human being, diminished. Because it's I think there's something harmful in it. I'm thinking about a poem to finish with, Jake. Poem that I wrote a couple of years ago.
Great idea.
This is called Difference. My difference brought no shame, though your voices proclaimed otherwise. Your gospel, a violent one. No room at the end for other. Preachings of contempt, disgust, and disdain became my crucifixion, until I became the crucifier and the crucified. One day I heard a voice, but these words could not yet calm the rage. Slowly I began to surrender. Love was my birthright. Coming down from that cross, I began to speak only your name.
Amen.
Amen. See you next time.
See you next time. Thank you.
You have been listening to The Hinge, a podcast presented by Noel O'Driscoll and Jake Esman, produced by Jer Kellett. Feel free to contact the show in the comments or by emailing us at thehingepodcast@gmail.com. Join us next week for another episode of The Hinge.